This is the English on Air podcast where we interview interesting guests and teach English at the same time.
The story begins in Heidelberg in 1938, which is essentially a pinnacle point in the persecution of the Jews. This is the year in which we have something called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And this was a national pogrom against the Jews, which happened in the November. And this really started off this chain reaction of anti-Semitism and Jewish persecution throughout Germany. And the novel starts there, and you basically follow the story of this doctor and his wife and their two twin daughters through Kristallnacht. And during this fateful night, we learn that Eva Sarkany, his wife, is heavily pregnant. They're attacked on their way home from a meal out. It's her birthday, and he takes her out for a meal. But on the way home, they are attacked by a group of thugs, I suppose. And Eva she isn't actually physically attacked by anybody, but she falls to the ground. And you can imagine if a heavily pregnant woman falls, that can cause serious trauma to the baby. So she ends up with not a miscarriage, but a threatened miscarriage. She's rushed to hospital, and she has to have an emergency caesarean section. But unfortunately, the baby has suffered from a lack of oxygen in the womb during that time before her having surgery, and is born with a cerebral palsy, where the baby has not had enough oxygen and the brain has been damaged. There are various degrees of cerebral palsy. In this particular case, their baby Andras, is born with severe cerebral palsy. And this creates an enormous tension for the family, because you've got a husband who is completely indoctrinated in Nazi ideology about euthanasia and these children and adults actually being what the Nazis used to call useless mouths, i.e. mouths that were useless to society and were just a drain on society. So you have this period in the book where you don't quite know what's going to happen to the child. The couple, the family, i.e. doctor, wife and twins, move back to Hungary, where they're from, and for a period of time, live a relatively normal life. But of course, in 1944, the Germans invade Hungary, and you then see German, or the Nazi persecution of the Hungarian Jews, organised primarily by Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of the transport system, but also a man who was commandant of Auschwitz called Rudolf Höss. These two men masterminded this terrible genocide where within a few months, hundreds of thousands of Jews from Hungary were gassed in the crematoria of Auschwitz. Thankfully, the Hungarian government eventually stopped this, but the numbers that were sent over such a short period were truly horrific. And my characters get embroiled in this. After the Germans invade Hungary, first of all, they experience all of the anti-Semitism that they'd already experienced in Germany, but then they are sent to a ghetto. And the book describes, through diary entries, I must say, life in a typical ghetto for a Jewish family. And this is based on many first-hand accounts of people's stories of ghettos and what ghetto life was like. But eventually, of course, this was liquidated, the ghetto was no more, and the family find themselves being transported. They don't know where, but they end up at the death camp in Poland that we now know as Auschwitz, or to be more precise, Auschwitz-Birkenau, because it was the Birkenau complex that was expanded and used as the killing centre.
Can I just comment on that? I thought the part where they're transported from Hungary to the camp, I think that was very well described in the book. I think that was really well described, where it was so sort of, they were so rammed into the characters,
yes.
Totally inhumane, and it was very cruel. But the way it was described in your book is really well described. It did feel that you were there, kind of.
It was interesting. That was the first part of the book I actually wrote. As I said before, I started at the point where he was Dr. Sarkany was on that transport. He'd been separated from his wife and children the day before, so he was on his own, crammed into one of these cattle cars, leaving Hungary, God knows where. You had perhaps up to 120 people crammed into one place. One bucket for going to the toilet in and another bucket of cold water, and your journey could last 2, 3, 4, maybe more days. So many people died on the journey. Many people lost their minds, and it was a harrowing experience. And of course, this was on top of them already having suffered all the deprivations of ghetto life for months. So when they arrived at that infamous ramp in Birkenau, they were broken already. They'd been through months of persecution, months of ghettoisation, this horrific transport, and then they're all spilled out onto this ramp, and then under dreadful circumstances separated into those who will live. Well, no, I will say that again. Those who will die quickly in the gas chambers and those who will die slowly in the camp itself. When you arrive in Auschwitz-Birkenau, you're not meant to live, you're meant to die, but your choice of death is up to you, partly. Because if you survive the selection process, and Mengele was very much part of this, you were sent to the main camp where you basically underwent what the Germans called extermination through labour, which was essentially you worked yourself to death on sub-optimum rations. The barracks were just inhumane, and you died probably, if you worked outside, particularly in a commando that was very heavy, 3 months at most. Most people probably lasted 6 months. Some did manage to survive longer, and obviously some survived to see the liberation. But many, well, a majority didn't survive. They died either in the gas chambers or in the camp itself. And don't forget, many people chose to commit suicide, so you could actually choose to go to the wire, as they say, which is literally running to that high tension barbed wire that ran throughout the camp and killing yourself that way. But, horrific circumstances.
There is a part in the book, now, or certainly remembering that I've read 2 versions of the book. I've read I've read it very early on, the manuscript, and then I read it probably a year later, which still wasn't the finished version, I don't believe. But there is a part of the story where certain individuals, certain characters in the book are taken to some kind of mine. Is that correct? Some kind of mining station, which what you were just describing as this like working someone to death. That was particularly harrowing.
So the book, as I say, is written predominantly in the diary format, and one of the things I wanted to get across that I couldn't do with the diary of Dr. Sarkany was a character completely different from him, someone that was much more anti-establishment, anti-Nazi, that would ultimately be a Nazi hunter after the war. And this character is a Pole, and his name in the book is Michael Kowalski, and he is a character that I enjoyed writing because he was completely different from my other character, and I could impart a certain amount of vulgarity, some humour, some dark humour in it. And it's that part of the book that you're talking about where he's sent to one of the sub-camps in Auschwitz called Buna, which he absolutely hates. And he works for a particular capo, they're called. These are the kind of people in charge. They're prisoners, but they work for the Nazis, these capos, called Shark. And you'll find out why he's called Shark. But, he has a terrible time in this camp, basically working in Shark's concrete commando, where he has to basically dig tunnels and lay concrete. And, again, as you say, it's a death sentence. But this character does manage to get out of Buna and finds himself working with Dr. Sarkany in the main crematorium, because his backstory is the fact that he went to medical school. He dropped out of medical school and then became a very good mortician. Mengele selected him to be his mortician to work under Sarkany in this terrible situation they were both forced into, where they had to literally